We're going to kick off this afternoon with our next panel, The Movement for Change, and without further ado, I'm going to welcome Julie McCulloch from ASCL to chair the panel and my fellow members of the panel to come and join us.
Thank you very much, Olly. Olly's doing a fantastic double act, introducing us and then joining us on the panel. So thank you for that. Thank you very much for the invitation to chair this panel and to join this fantastic conference in this amazing venue. It's great to be here. We are going to follow on, I hope, from some of the conversations that were taking place this morning, but with a particular focus now about what does the future look like? You know, what might we be moving towards if we start to think about assessing children and young people in a different way. I've got a fantastic panel who I'm going to ask to introduce themselves in a second. We've got a very short time for a very big question. We've got 45 minutes, so I'm going to ask the panellists to introduce themselves really briefly, and then we'll get into a discussion about where we think things are working well in the current system, and most importantly, where we might want to see change. So I'm going to hand straight over to the panel. We'll just go down the table in this order, if that's okay. If you could just tell us who you are and what you do, very briefly your background, and then we'll get into the conversations.
Great stuff. David Gallagher, Chief Executive at NCFE. And for those of you that don't know NCFE, we're primarily an awarding and endpoint assessment organisation. And actually were born in the first industrial revolution in 1848. So we've seen all of the industrial revolutions to this point. And so all things assessment, absolutely of interest to us.
Thank you, David. Bill.
Thanks, David. Still a revolutionary as well, aren't you? Bill Lucas, Professor of Learning at University of Winchester, with other colleagues in the room, co-founder of Rethinking Assessment, was the co-chair of the PISA Creative Thinking Test of 2022. It was a year late because of the pandemic, but it is showing that we can do this kind of thing. And I guess I'm an educational reformer who's felt he's been in the slow lane for 40 years, but it's just getting a glimpse that we might be becoming in the ascendancy.
Hi, I'm Bexby McCulloch. I'm the CEO of AET. We run 57 schools, primary, secondary, special schools, the length and breadth of the country. I very rarely describe myself as that. I think it's much more straightforward to still see myself as a teacher.
And I'm Sarah Fletcher. I'm the head of St Paul's Girls' School, but I've taught in any number of different schools, state, maintained and independent, international and here at home. And I have been interested in reform of education since I was a little teacher all those years ago. I'm a member of Rethinking Assessment. I lead on HMC, a reform of assessment group of wonderful heads, and I am delighted to be a co-founder of this particular conference, along with the Edge Foundation, Rethinking Assessment and others.
Thanks, Sarah. As you know, I'm Olly Newton, but a bit of kind of relevant background. So I spent 12 years in the Department for Education. I'm now making amends for that. But the first policy I worked on there was 14 to 19 diplomas, which I think is an important part of this conversation. More recently, I've been Specialist Advisor to the House of Lords Committee on Youth Unemployment, which recommended change in this area, and on the Independent Assessment Commission that our colleagues at NEU set up.
Fantastic, thank you all. Ex-civil servants who've been let loose to speak their mind are always great people to talk to. So good to have you all here. Thank you very much. So I'm going to start really just to get a sense from all of you about what you think is currently working well about our assessment system and what you think is working less well. So we'll get on slightly further into the conversation to specific changes you'd like to see. But for now, just where do you think we're getting it right and where are we not? And I'll start perhaps with the people closest to the front line. Bex and Sarah, do you want to give us a sense of, from your perspective, in your school, your trust, what do you think's working well, what's not so good?
I think one of the things that's most important to say is that I have the utmost respect for all young people who take the GCSEs and the A-levels. I think that they are putting themselves forward with a huge amount of work, and they should feel very, very proud of what they're doing. And one of the things that upsets me year on year is that around exam time, the newspapers are full of comments about how these qualifications aren't worth their salt. And in fact, what we should be doing is celebrating a huge amount of effort and a huge amount of achievement by young people. Having said that, I think there are significant flaws with the way that we, not they, are framing the education system. I think they are put forward as being fair qualifications because everybody takes them pretty much at the same time, only 3 exam boards, very heavily regulated, and that they are therefore ipso facto robust and fit for purpose. I think that those very phrases or words contain within them the essence of the weakness of the system that we've currently got. There's a huge amount of emphasis on regulation, upon uniformity within the system, has produced a set of qualifications which I think have narrowed, becoming very academic. They've narrowed in the style of questions that are asked, which is a particular problem for me within assessment, narrowed particularly in order to remove a sense of judgment one particular marker against another. And so mark schemes have become much narrower over the time that I have been in education, and young people are rewarded more for giving the right answer than for giving an answer which indicates independent thinking, creativity, what they can do. And I used in the previous breakout room an image which has been in my head for ages, that education, in fact, is boxes within boxes within boxes. The boxes of schools, the boxes of the classroom, the box of the teacher, the box of the exam, the box of the mark scheme. And every box has a lid. And every lid defines and every lid limits. If what we're doing is lifting those lids, in fact, to invite young people to show us what they can do rather than what we want them to do, then I think we'll see a real transformation in education. And particularly, I think a massive weakness of the current system is the way that we're examining. And again, it comes down to this issue of perceived fairness. Apparently, it's only fair if you put people in an exam room, you set them a timed condition, you ask them to work on their own without any reference to anyone else or to the outside world. And apparently that's fair, but I don't believe it. I think there are so many people with learning difficulties, neurodiverse difficulties, people for whom they don't respond to that way of assessing exams, assessing their work. It's sudden death right at the end of a course. There's nothing formative about it. It's summative assessment. There's an awful lot in there that I think we need to rethink before we actually move forward into a future where we feel genuinely that we are preparing young people for the world in which they're about to live.
Thanks, Sarah. Bex.
I always feel slightly uncomfortable critiquing the sort of current system of assessment when you're thinking about external assessments, because it feels slightly disingenuous when you know, I'm responsible for thousands of children that will be sitting GCSEs, A-levels, BTECs this summer, and want them to do the very best and know how hard both they and their teachers are working. And I also think that it can sort of dilute our ambition and imagination for the future to start from what's wrong now, because the current system is born out of the wider system that it sits within. And so I think perhaps a more interesting question is, what are the trade-offs of a national external system of assessment, and what purposes do we want it to deliver? I think, you know, pragmatically, a lot of it for me comes down to time. I think that it's interesting that we often conflate assessment and qualifications. I think they're two very different things, but we spend a lot of time on both of them. I think fundamental to me from a sort of teacher's perspective is we've sort of got ourselves lost in this trap that actually the value of a subject is in the qualifications that students gain. And I do think that our young people are over-examined, and I think that they sit GCSEs in subjects where we actually, I think we do damage to the subjects by considering a GCSE as a sort of signal of success. I taught PE for many, many years. And I've never been convinced that PE should be examined at GCSE. I don't see that that particularly reflects, you know, success for an individual young person, and I don't think it's particularly ambitious. I would think similarly of music. And so I think for me it comes down to what are the trade-offs of our current system of qualifications and assessment? What do we think the purposes should be? What needs to be true for us to think ambitiously and differently, and work back from there?
Thank you. So that those questions around, you know, Sarah's points about enabling people to show what they can do, I think is a really strong theme that kind of comes out in these conversations. And your points there, Bex, about kind of do we put too much emphasis, I guess, on qualifications? Isn't assessment broader, and certainly isn't learning broader? I think that's a theme we'll come back to. Bill, can I come to you from your view of sort of, having spent a lot of time thinking about this issue, looking internationally perhaps, how do we compare? What works well here and less well?
I'll come on to the comparing later on, if that's okay, but just to this question, the current system. I think, and I'm a dad of two 18-year-old twins who've just been through it, a mixture of A-levels and BTECs, and I'd say that many brilliant teachers and hard-working students managed to give us glimpses of what our kids can do, despite its curiously narrow choice of methods. And I think they, as Sarah said, the kids and the teachers are to be absolutely applauded for that. But you can see that's rather damning with faint praise, isn't it? If that's the best I can come up with for the current system. I'd go further and say it's a bit like, for those of us who've been watching the World Cup, it's a bit like life being decided on a penalty shootout after a really compelling second half, after a full match, after 2 years of training beforehand. And it's that cruel. And it's the cruelty bit, I think, that gets me. My daughter, who's been working very, very hard, rang me on her way to her sixth form college to say she'd just been sick. What should she be doing? And what do you say as a parent? So it's not just fiction that this has a really critically unkind effect on many lovely kids. I would say that, wouldn't I? Because she's my daughter. So they're no longer fit for purpose. Let's be obvious about this. They're cruel, they're random, they're inappropriate, they're overly high stakes, they're ludicrously blind to the differing talents that students might have. Apart from that, they're okay, aren't they? They tend almost exclusively and painfully, quite not what Andy Haldane was arguing, to be focusing on the knowledge element of a really rich subject. So maths, I want to know what it's like to think as a mathematician, not just whether you can do some of the things that will get you a 2-marker or a 3-marker. It ignores many of the things that most of us care about. We had quite a lot of that this morning. Sometimes called in Rethinking Assessment the 3 C's, so creativity, including critical thinking, communication, especially oracy, and collaboration, working with other people, maybe people we don't know, maybe asynchronously on tricky but worthwhile projects together. And here's my real beef. It's as if the only way we know to test attributes is to stick people, regardless of their age, in a stinky gymnasium for 2 or 3 hours and assume that's going to give us a hint at what they can do. I mean, it's not true, is it, colleagues? I mean, we know that that's just to take a tiny slice of the many methods that are out there, whether you're looking at apprentices, whether you're looking at the testing of music. We can have an interesting debate about that, but it's multimodal. Whether we're thinking about what you do at the highest level of higher education, where you have a viva. And we would not perhaps allow that yet enough in schools. So it's a gamma minus for me.
Thank you very much. David, can we come to you? So from your perspective, particularly interested, I guess, in vocational, technical assessment and how all of that works, but anything you'd like to share?
Yeah, absolutely. And in the interest of time, I'll skip over strengths, if that's okay. Building very much on Bill's points, actually. So I think we now have a mainstream assessment system that is largely detached from reality. And what I mean by that is, to this point around the stinky gym, at what other point in time in your life will you ever be required to sit in that fear-inducing, vomit-inducing sort of situation for so many people? And fear, we know, just doesn't bring the best out in people. Even employers get this now. Enlightened employers put people at ease through a recruitment process and get to know them through so many different dimensions to ascertain as to whether they are the right person for their organisation. It's about behaviours, it's about values, it's about skills, it's about competence, and of course it is still about knowledge in some instances. But we don't put people in fear-inducing situations, or at least we shouldn't if we are enlightened employers. And I completely recognise that not every part of education is about a job, about a career. But if we're setting people up for life, and yet that will be a situation that will never be repeated. So I've got a real worry, despite the fact that we certificate 400,000 learners a year through very traditional methods in a number of instances, that assessment in the mainstream is becoming an anachronism, and the commercial and corporate world will see us become obsolete unless we completely radically shift how we do things. So that's the first point. The second point I would say is, and there's just three, our current approach to assessment propagates this low trust paradigm that we have in our system. We're all leaders in our organisations. If you run an organisation on low trust, what happens? What happens? It becomes toxic, it's corrosive, it's damaging, culture is horrendous, yet we run a system on low trust and wonder why we've got a problem. And what I mean by that is, and this isn't a criticism of any one institution, but we've got Ofsted, we've got DFE, we've got ESFE, we've got governors, we've got awarding bodies, we are one, all checking that people are doing it the way they should be doing it. What the hell is wrong with trusting educators who have got the expertise, the experience, the skills and the ideas to free them up? And I'm not saying, be completely put us out of business. But I do think there's, this low trust paradigm is not healthy for our system. And I do think our approaches to assessment propagate that. The final point is around the transactional approaches that we take to assessment. How many times, when we undertake an assessment or a learner does, whether it's formative, micro, or whether it's summative, synoptic, high stakes, whatever it might be, how many times do we look at that and think, well, that just conveys the outcome, pass, fail, A, B, 7, 8, 9, merit, distinction. There's a massive opportunity there to use the richness of data that can be derived at a learner level, at a cohort level, at an institutional level, and at a systems level. What's working, what's not? How do we improve the system? How do we use that rich vein of insight and intelligence to figure out how to continuously improve? And somebody said to me once, I asked, what's the difference between formative and summative? I'm not a teacher. And they said, well, formative's for learning, summative's about learning. I said, well, why isn't summative for learning as well? I went, good question. Good question. And there's a vein of insight there that could inform learners, parents, educators, what could be done, should be done next, where are strengths, where are weaknesses, where are opportunities, where should we focus? And running an awarding organisation that certificates 400,000 learners a year, virtually none of our centres ask for the item level analysis to understand that. That's horrifying. Such a massive missed opportunity.
That's fascinating, thank you. I think that's something we see kind of at every stage, isn't it? As children and young people move up through the system, that their previous educator has so much rich information about them that doesn't ever necessarily get passed on to the next stage. So how might assessment kind of help to build that? I think is a really interesting question. Thank you. Olly, any final thoughts on kind of the current system before we move on?
Thanks so much, Julie. So I think when Sarah and I were first talking about this, we were saying really that we were struggling to find people outside sanctuary buildings who didn't see the win-win in this. And I think that's what we're starting to see through the day. We're seeing employers, HE, teaching professionals, young people in that excellent panel, all kind of saying similar things. So I wanted to just reflect on that a little bit. So from the young people's perspective, we had that great panel, if you weren't in it, to kind of share a couple of messages. I guess one of the young people that we spoke to as part of the Independent Assessment Commission was a 12-year-old boy in a school in the Northeast, and something he said really stuck with me. He said, when we're at work, we get assessed on what we do. When we're in school, we get assessed on what we remember. He was 12, and we hadn't prepped him for that session. That was just what his reflection on the education system as he knew it. So it's not, we don't give young people enough credit for understanding the rules of the game and how things work behind the scenes. So there's a clear kind of aim there. Then talking to a university professor, I kid you not, this person is called Professor Kneebone, and he teaches surgery, and I haven't made it up. He's a surgery professor at Imperial College who we've worked with, and he was telling me how he can take the pick from people with A-levels of anywhere in the country. It's a really competitive course, but he absolutely can't find people with hand sewing skills. Now, when you, God forbid, going for an operation, you want to be sewn up neatly and tidily, and so he'd even hired a lace maker to be an artist in residence in his surgery to give them those hand skills. But it just spoke to me again about how you can learn it in, as Sally was saying earlier with plumbers, you can learn it in theory, but until you've done the practice. And then when we think about employers, we've done a lot of research. There's a huge amount out there, and we summarise this a couple of times a year in our skills shortage bulletins about how employers are feeling, and we had some great contributions on this earlier. But overwhelmingly, the research, even from the government's own employer perspective survey, is that employers are looking for technical skills, and they're looking for those transferable skills. And I think we mustn't create a false dichotomy or kind of an issue where there isn't one, where people say, oh, well, life's about more than those employability skills. Actually, those are the same skills that we probably want in our children, in our communities. We want people to be good communicators and empathetic and resilient. So I think those are kind of the broader skills that we need. So I think that my reflection would be, yes, there are things that we don't want to sweep everything away, but it feels like there is a really strong coalition for change amongst all of those groups, saying actually it's a win-win to recognise young people's broader achievements.
Brilliant, thank you. Love your example of nominative determinism. Professor Kneebone is wonderful. Sarah, did you want to come back in?
I just wanted to add something about the digital world. If you look at how we are delivering, and I'm using that word advisedly, the GCSEs particularly, and A-levels, and then you consider how we're preparing young people for, in fact, a digital, technologically advanced world, there's a massive disconnect. And just to build on the Professor Kneebone story, I was talking as well to a medical profession, and what they were saying was that they absolutely love it when young people present skills in video games. And I asked why, and they said, well, if you can imagine a future where surgery is not in fact hands-on, but it's all being done by machine and remotely, then in fact what you want is people who are able to read the screen and who are able to react in that kind of a way. Fascinating, but nothing to do with what we're teaching currently at GCSE.
Fantastic. Thank you all. Some real food for thought there about what is and isn't working at the moment. Let's build on that and think about how you might like to see things change in the future. You've obviously been touching on this morning already, but to get into that in a bit more detail. Bill, shall I come to you first on this?
Sure. Just a preparatory remark that builds on something that Olly said. It would be really sad, wouldn't it, if we ended up in a bun fight between those of us who believe in knowledge and those of us who believe in whatever you want to call them, attributes or dispositions. We need both, don't we? It's an and I think we have to move past that. If this whole debate, and I think you'll see a really broad church here, gets painted into a traditional versus progressive, we've lost. So I think it's a really, really important mindset issue. And I think the second thing, and rather than waste too much of your time, on the Rethinking Assessment website, there's a digest of promising global practices. It's called Rethinking Assessment in Education, the Case for Change. And it will show you some of the extraordinary range of things that are happening across the world. These include, but aren't limited to, really smart digital multiple choice type answers which enable you to use free text. They include extended investigations, rigorous, detailed investigations of the kind that medics in Canada taught us when they were trying to get doctors much better able to deal with real-life situations. They've been using problem-based learning for a very long while. Micro-credentialing, sometimes called digital badging, I think there are little bits of what we value that we can get better at credentialing. I'm sure that's something that we might have conversations, David, you and I, about. I think the thing that is so obvious to anybody who isn't an educator is that you might want to test someone when they're ready, on demand, rather than on one single June afternoon when somebody may be very young in their age group, or very old in their age group. What palpable disadvantage is embedded in that, for goodness sake? And online, we had lots of examples earlier on about that. A games-based assessment is coming along. AI and comparative judgment is really promising. We know that works in the assessment of English scripts, written scripts, humanities-type scripts, and it may be worth exploring more in oracy even. And the most important, and I think the most dynamic and the most exciting, is the advent potentially, and Andy mentioned this, of a digital learner profile. In Australia, it's now national policy that when you leave your high school, you will have not only your high school leaving certificate, but a national profile. A profile that shows all of the things that you can do in one place. It's kind of learning LinkedIn. And this is what we're really majoring on in Rethinking Assessment. There's a number of prototypes being developed. There are proofs of concept across the world. A sister organisation to us, Rethinking Assessment in New Metrics for Success in Melbourne, Australia, is similarly doing this. Something called the Mastery Transcript Consortium, very much another organisation, Global Bridge, have working prototypes. There are all sorts of school-based Google initiatives here that we can learn from. I was with others actually in the room on the Independent Commission for Primary Assessment in Primary Education, and we're really majoring there on the use of portfolios in primary. So you get used to assessment as learning, for learning, as a way of being. So you don't have to answer David's difficult exam question, is it summative or is it formative? Because it's just appropriate. It's fit for purpose. And your question is then, what are my desired outcomes here, and how best might I evidence them? In terms of the very short term, in terms of what we might do in England, I've written this down just to be crisp here, because I know we're up against the clock. I think, and I enjoyed Chris's session earlier on, I think we could ramp up the take-up of EPQ. Currently, in a cohort of about 600,000, 30,000 take EPQ. So we could ramp that up. We could do that next year. We don't have to wait for any government initiative for that to happen. Although the AQA has stopped offering the HPQ, I think we could really think about how we could develop the HPQ. I think City and Guilds and Pearson's offer it. I think there's an alliance to be done there. I think, for goodness sake, secondary colleagues, we could reduce the number of GCSEs that we invite kids to do, couldn't we? It's not attainment 11, is it? But yet many of the schools I go into, it feels like a kind of competitive job to show how many GCSEs you're offering, which seems very silly. I think we can look at a range of other accredited options. A sneaky way of doing this is to go to the UCAS database and see what's valued there. And you'll see things like Arts Award or the University of Arts short courses, the Duke of Edinburgh, obviously, the Royal Schools of Music and the Rock School music exams, the Crest Award, ASDAN certificates, a lot of very interesting awards, as does the Institute of Leadership and Management. Now, there's a long list there, but we could do quite a lot of that, and we could do it tomorrow. But most of all, I think we need a national movement focusing on really getting the portfolio and the profile to work. Probably digital, but not necessarily always. There's something quite satisfying too, isn't there, in seeing the actual artifacts that young people have made with their hands and with their hearts as well as with their heads.
Fantastic.
For starters.
If we had another hour, you could give us another 24, I'm sure. David, let me come to you. You talked about your sort of frustration with the transactional nature of assessment and thinking more about trusting educators, trusting young people, I guess, as well, in terms of what they're demonstrating. What might that look like?
Yeah, okay. I'll just use a really brief anecdote that hopefully will draw this out. I had a small training provider speak to me a couple of years back. It was just pre-pandemic, and said, first thing she said to me was, David, your functional skills assessments are really boring and disengaging, which was an interesting opening gambit. And so I was a little bit taken aback. But actually, the point that was then very well made was that this particular provider was dealing with some of the most disadvantaged, deprived learners imaginable, offenders, ex-offenders, people in coming off drug and alcohol dependencies, all sorts of, challenging life circumstances, typically who had hated mainstream education, completely disaffected from that. And they'd designed and developed and were delivering this fantastically creative, brilliant curriculum. And then they got to our functional skills exam and people just left the programme or give it one go, and that was it. And so, and what she said to me was, look, what we've done is we've recreated your functional skills exam as a physical escape room, and we think it's valid, and we think it's reliable, and we think it's scalable. So we said, all right then. So we set up an assessment innovation fund and said, we'll test out whether that can be turned into this valid, reliable assessment. As it's worked through to scale it, we've this provider, with a bit of financial support from us, has turned this into a story-based, role-play, puzzle-type digital assessment, and we're just testing whether actually that can be valid, reliable, robust, rigorous, all of these good things that we want it to be. Engagement's gone through the roof because we're just thinking differently. And why can we not think more broadly about assessments actually being a really positive, experiential thing that is a valuable part of the educational experience, the learning experience in of itself? So this talks to this shift from transactional to actually something that's more transformational. The other point, and this is a link point, I sort of came to the conclusion a couple of years ago, I think it was, that life is best when it's played as a team sport. I suddenly realised that leadership as a team sport is when leadership is at its best. I believe family is at its best when you play it as a team sport. We've even got our boys doing little different jobs now, and life is much better and easier. And it got me reflecting on education, and all of the bits of education that I took a huge amount of value from were the bits that were played as a team sport. And when you look at life more broadly, nobody really achieves anything on their own. Do you know, even elite athletes that perform in individual sort of disciplines are supported by an army of people that enable them to be there, and less than 10% of all of their work is done on an individual basis. The rest of the time it's with trainers, it's with sports scientists, it's with nutritionists, etc., etc., etc. So life is a team sport, other than in tiny little examples. Yet the minute we get to any sort of assessment in the mainstream, right, forget that this is a team sport, it's just on you. So the one other thing that I would say to shift this to something that is truly transformational is let's start looking for opportunities to assess people in teams, because the rest of your life, the rest of your career journey, you're going to be playing in a team of some variety. And actually, wouldn't that bridge some divides, some barriers that we've got in society more broadly as well? So for me, those two things, inclusive, fair, engaging, and think about it as a team sport whenever there's an opportunity, which I accept sometimes it's not appropriate, but a lot of the time it absolutely would be.
Brilliant.
And of course, the EPQ is a good example of how you can do that right now. Same with the HPQ.
I'm now having thoughts about people in 20 years' time having anxiety dreams about escape rooms the way that they currently do about exams, but I know I would. We don't have a lot of time left, but I want to give colleagues on elsewhere on the panel a chance to answer as well before we maybe have time for one or two questions from the audience. But perhaps if I come down to the bottom end of the table there, could you have a think in your answer about not just what you might like to see differently, but how do we take the profession with us? You know we have a profession that's very weary. We've had an enormous amount of reform, particularly in assessment over the last decade. If we are going to make the sorts of changes that we might like to see, how do we take people with us and make it work for them? Bex, let's start with you.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sort of listening. I could very easily get quite sort of overexcited and sort of enthusiastic about lots of the ideas I hear. And I think that ideas are essential to generate momentum, but progress, I think, demands patience and pragmatism. And if we're going to take the profession with us, I think we've got to be really thoughtful. I think we need to be really, really cogent in our thinking, both sort of present, forward and future back. I think we need to work our way up to a different future in a way that allows for incremental progress, that builds teachers, takes teachers with us, builds their skills and capacities as we start to do things differently. In our organisation, we've set ourselves some fairly punchy ambitions for 2028. That means the children who started in reception this year, the children who start in year 7 next year. I genuinely think if we're going to do something that fundamentally shifts the dial, we've got to buy ourselves enough time to be able to do it properly and meaningfully. And I also think that we have to be really careful to avoid a sort of implicit criticism of what's currently happening in our schools and classrooms, because it's really tough. And we also need to not lose sight of the fact that we still have a third of young people who leave our state education system and they're not literate or numerate. And so we need to be really, really, I think, quite honest with ourselves about the gap between where we are today, particularly for our most disenfranchised and marginalised young people, and where we believe they can be and hope we can be as a sector in 5, 10, 15 years' time. And in order to get there, I think that we need to set ourselves some realistic staging posts. I don't think we're going to get from GCSEs today to escape rooms tomorrow in one leap. And I think we have to be careful that we don't lose the opportunity for profound change by not taking people with us.
Thank you. Sarah.
I think lots of things. First of all, I think we need to create a very strong case for change. And part of that is to write a new dictionary. I think we need a proper lexicon which actually explains what we mean by various words. So I've used the word creativity in an hour-long conversation with people in the DFE and realised at the end of it that our use of the word was totally different. For me, the word creativity means robust, it means really deep learning. For them, it meant effectively finger painting. It's the dichotomy as well between skills and knowledge. All of these things, I think, first of all, we need on the table a dictionary which explains what we mean. And then we can stop getting lost in conversations which, in fact, shouldn't be there. We should have moved past them. We need to do that first. I think a second thing that we need to do is to consult. I remember when I was a little teacher, forming the national curriculum and being asked as a history teacher to go to a hotel in Manchester with other historians and to discuss what we wanted for the future. And it was so inspiring that I can remember it, and it sends shivers down my spine to this day. And I would love to engage the teaching profession in a proper conversation about what they think the future should hold and what they think the future should look like, because they hold the knowledge. I think the other thing that we need is a 10-year plan at least, and a promise that it's not going to get shifted like Tomlinson because of political changes, because of shifts. I think we need a promise that what we can do is to work together, and by that I mean for the first time ever, schools from primary right the way through, colleges, universities, working together to create our common threads and our common vision for the future. And we need a promise that this is a 10-year plan, and that out of that is going to come change, and it's going to be properly funded, and it's going to link up with teacher training too, which we don't often talk about. So something that we know when we begin the journey is going to be a practical journey, but it is also going to be a visionary one, but it's going to be focused on the young people. And finally, I think we need to understand that assessment has got to be for different things, and we've got to be honest about that. The government's not going to let anyone get away unless we can in some shape or form show some kind of accountability and some kind of rigour in their sense of the word. So potentially adaptive testing in certain subjects, numeracy, literacy, potentially running through, but an understanding that at 16 plus we don't need high stakes assessment in everything that we do, but that in fact we should have a worked through system of assessment which works through from Key Stage 1 right the way through up to Key Stage 5 and then has links into the world beyond. I think if we can present that kind of joined up vision, that kind of sense of practicality and that sense that it's the profession that's talking about it and not a political agenda, then I think we can begin to enthuse and inspire and move things forward.
Thank you. Bill, you were indicating you'd like to come back in.
Yeah, it kind of builds on something that Beck said. I mean, I agree we've got to work our way towards it and not rush it. I agree with that, but not too painstakingly slowly so that we watch the paint dry, because you've only got one shot at this in the first part of your 100-year life. And so where we've got to in rethinking assessment is thinking, as well as the profile, there are two areas that might be really helpful to focus on. And both Phil Avery and Amelia Peterson are in the room here, looking at interdisciplinary, project-based learning, really thinking how that can be rigorous. The London Interdisciplinary School is the first, as well as NMIT, higher education institution founded on these principles of interdisciplinarity. So this is not some kind of nonsensical new idea. And the second is take one of those C's, and we've gone for creative thinking. It's what PISA's been exploring. There's really robust evidence, and doing exactly as Beck said. So last year we had a series of quite light touch action research projects. This year it's an intervention study with a research partner from Australia, looking at the evidence, looking at the definition, being clear about it, looking at how it's embedded in Key Stage 2 and 3 programs of study in English, science, design and technology, art and design and history. So we can say, look, you can do it now, not tomorrow, not if there's one of those or a wind change, but you can do it now. And then it's leadership at all levels and professional learning, and you can't rush that. And that's going to take us a couple of years. But we're reckoning that by the time the ink will be dry on the manifestos, if the current lot hold their nerve for another 18 months, 2 years, we'll be very able to be specific about both what we can do within the existing system and what great colleagues like you in the room might do if we were able just to make some changes. So I'm an optimist on that.
Fantastic. Ollie, with your conference organiser's hat on, we started slightly late, but do we need to wrap up? I'm sorry, we're going to run out of time, I think, to do audience questions, unless you want to give it a couple of minutes.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Julie.
Fine.
Let's put our hands together for the panel.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, all of you. Fascinating discussion. Sorry we didn't get to questions from the audience, but I'm sure you'll all have opportunities to talk as the day goes on. So thank you very much to all the panellists for a brilliant conversation.
Well, let's begin with exams, because they now dominate the English education system. And I introduced GCSEs back in the 1980s, because then about half the students left at 16, and they needed a certificate just to show what they'd achieved. When I took the predecessor, the school certificate in 1950, 93% left and only 7% stayed on. So it was very important to take a certificate away so you've got a distinction, accredited or pass. Come now, it's exactly the reverse. 93% stay on and 7% leave. So there is not a compelling need for a leaving certificate today.
I think we've come far enough and we're intelligent enough to be able to offer assessment which measures how young people and older learners are progressing, and outcome measures which actually show where they've reached and the quality of the provision as well as the achievement of the learner. And I think in doing that, we need a whole range of different ways in which we can assess that progress. We do it very well the higher up the qualifications ladder you climb. So at university, we wouldn't dream of only assessing one particular formula in terms of qualification. We wouldn't dream of doing that in terms of work-based learning, and we wouldn't dream of doing it in terms of assessing language skills. So why not use the most sensible and available methods to both assess how young people are doing in terms of their teamwork and critical skills, and at the same time be able to assess their grasp of a body of knowledge, of theory, and of scholarship.
It slightly comes back to what's the purpose of education? Because probably your assessment system should be assessing whether or not we're fulfilling the purpose of education. I think the purpose for education is probably threefold. One would be to give people the capacity to connect up to opportunities they'll want in their life. I think the second would be to enable them to be contributing members of a wider community and society they're part of. And I think a third purpose of education for me would be to give people a love of learning. That means they can continue to develop themselves right the way through their lives, and that this experience of education at the beginning of it isn't something that then puts them off for life. So in a sense, if that's the purpose of education that I've set out, you'd really be then putting in place an assessment system that checked our progress against meeting those three elements of that purpose.
I think whatever we do, and when people have been talking about, for instance, the International Baccalaureate, you really do need to skill teachers to be able to take on new methodology. It's good anyway in terms of continuing professional development. It's good in terms of stimulating and motivating staff, but it's absolutely critical if we're going to move on.
I think that's a really good point. And if effectively teachers are busting a gut on these wider skills and competencies, they're doing that, but in a sense it's out of sight, and in a way their development is really very often channeled around their ability to get children to the level they need to be in the academic subjects they're studying. I think if you ask anyone who their best teacher was they had at school, it's probably not going to be the one that was the academic master in conveying knowledge. It's going to be that other person that inspired them, that excited them. And so in a sense, I think it does partly come back to career development for teachers and personal development for teachers.
What I would like to see replacing it is 5 subjects, and then every school from 11 to 16 should have 5 subjects: English, maths, 2 science, and data skills. And then the heads and the pupils should decide which other subjects they want, which they find attractive.
We're not set up even in the short term to say, are children and young people coming out of the education system career ready? And we're not then measuring what happens afterwards, so taking any cohorts of them, so that a school would be able to get a sense of how did our children do. For universities, of course, increasingly, that's what they're under pressure to demonstrate, that final step of education leads to a job. But the reality is they're kind of being put on notice for performing on something that is the last 3 years, perhaps, of a person's education that they get in higher education from 18, say, to 21, potentially. And it completely misses to what extent the first, 14 years, as it were, or 16 years, were ones that helped them develop those skills they need.
Well, the remit from the leader of the Labour Party to me and those who were advising was very much about skills, but I couldn't possibly approach this without an understanding of how learners learn, how we progress in the digital age, how we take from what happens in school and preschool through to post-16 and into adult life, lifelong learning. And that lifelong learning journey with a learning passport would allow for the development of skills through life, but on the basis of something that you've grasped very early, which is how to work in teams, how to use critical thinking, how to ensure that we equip young people to be able to grasp rather than to be afraid of change. And that's true of our social life, our citizenship, our democracy, as it is of the technical side of the world of work and the grasp of scholarship. So the technical and the academic should be seen as complementary, not as in any way competitive.
I think there should be, because fundamentally we are transitioning from a country that has been almost this post-war version of Britain, I would describe, that was then part of a very big talent pool called the European Union and had freedom of movement, that put great store on a very pure academic performance, and universities was shifting from that to a version of Britain that actually has to rely on its own talent pool more than ever before. And therefore, productivity is becoming a big issue. And this issue of educational inequalities has become an issue because actually people being left behind means we are self-constraining our talent pool through not developing it effectively in the education system.
If you're determined enough to do it and you believe enough in it and you're convincing enough, and I think the time has come when all those qualities have got to come out in leadership and education. And that will really make it much less political. I think the Labour Party is moving slowly to that. They're not being radical enough, in my view, at the moment. And I'm trying to speak to some of their leaders to try to persuade them to follow the Blair approach, because Blair has got the best proposal at the moment on the Labour side.
If those of us of a certain age can be thinking radically and looking to the future in the way that I see cross-party we are doing, then I think that's a challenge to younger people. It's a challenge to us to be able to demonstrate what worked well and what went badly wrong, so we have a learning experience that we can hold from the past, but also to understand, to put it bluntly, if old codgers can have the creativity and the imagination and a belief in the future, come on, the rest of you can.
One Wonderful. Yeah, there's so much hope in that video. Also, I'm very envious of Lord Baker's ability to carry off a bright green shirt and a stripy tie and still look great. But yeah, I think you can see the degree of consensus there. I think for me, one question that I have that is kind of still in my mind is, what's the best way to get that consensus? Should we be thinking about depoliticise education, giving it to the Times Education Commission because Rachel's so sensible? Or can we build this kind of coalition because actually even coming from different viewpoints, as we heard there, politicians are increasingly perhaps coming around a consensus here? Not looking for answers on that, but I think there's an important tactical question for us as we think about the next steps.